Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Christopher Price. I'm Chief Executive of the Rare Breed Survival Trust, or RBST, and I'll be chairing this session for the next hour or so. Now, we're here to discuss farming profitably and sustainably with native livestock breeds. RBST exists to conserve our native livestock and equines, but we don't believe in conserving them just because they're part of biodiversity. It's not the same arguments that we use for conserving wildlife in general. It's more than that. One of the reasons, or the main reason really, why we conserve native livestock is because they came into being to meet human needs. They are there because they have a utility. Now, originally that utility may have been to provide us with food or clothing in the form of wool and skins, or even transport, the ability to pull or carry people. And one of the most effective ways of achieving our conservation objectives is by reminding people of that utility. In a way, native livestock are our most effective and important ecosystem services providers. But over time, needs have changed. We perhaps use native breeds less than we did for certain purposes, but increasingly we're finding new uses for them, and that's one of the more exciting areas. Perhaps the most obvious new area is conservation grazing. The more that we learn that the habitats, the meadows, the pastures that we cherish were shaped by the different grazing attributes of our different breeds, the more we realize how important they are in conserving those habitats and their landscape. So we're going to spend an hour or so discussing all this. We've got three fantastic speakers. I'm sure some of them will be known to you. John Atkinson and Maria Benjamin, who together farm in the Lake District, and they'll be telling us a bit more about what they do. And RBST's own Andrea Parry-Jones, who farms on Anglesey and is something of an expert in particular on conservation grazing. And I'll be asking them to start speaking in a moment. But first of all, a bit of housekeeping. It'd be great if you can ask questions, put them into the chat, and at the end, in an hour or maybe a bit less, we'll start picking out the most interesting, challenging, or frequently asked points, and hopefully you'll get some great feedback on those as well. So without more ado, I will hand over to, I think John is speaking first, and so on with the slides. So
I'm John Atkinson. I'm currently the chairman of the RBST. We farm in the Lake District, and I always say we farm between water and woods. So most of our land is wood pasture or has water margins, and we also farm moorland as well. The home farm is 50 acres, and then I have about 200 acres on long-term leases, and then we farm another 200 acres for conservation grazing for various organisations. It's a traditional small mixed family farm. And when Maria joined me on the farm, both me and Maria worked full-time as well as ran the farm. And we realised we didn't want to do that. So we looked at drastically changing how we farm to be able to work at home. And by doing that, we now both work from the farm, and we employ 3 part-time staff as well. So it's become an industry in its own right. For the last sort of 50 years, since, well, probably longer, since the Second World War, the rise of supermarkets and everything, we've been told as farmers to specialise, to produce one thing really well, to have everything exactly the same size, in the same sort of packaging and everything. And what we've done is the absolute opposite. And that has given us a unique market. And that's where the rare breeds come in the fact that you do have something that's unique, that's got its own story already. So I'd just like to introduce you to some of the primitive breeds of sheep. So as part of an RBST project, we took on some primitive wethers of all the different primitive breeds. We basically decided to, there've been other projects done where people have just got various breeds of animal and then done a taste test. But what we thought was we would get all the animals together and actually rear them on the same farm under the same conditions, and then slaughter them all at once in the same way in the same place, and then do a taste test. And we had all the different primitive breeds which Christopher is trying to move along. So Castleville Merits, Hebrideans, Shetlands, Manx Longton, Boré, North Lonsdale, and Surrey. There we are, the Surrey. So we kept all these animals for a year, and we sheared them. We took them to the slaughter eventually, and we had an event, and we did a taste test. And what was more surprising was when the butcher came to cut them up, he was really, really surprised about how much meat the animals had on them, and the texture and flavour of the meat. Especially the Castle Milks, Hebrideans, and the Manx Longton had really good carcasses that would have gone in any butcher's. Nobody would have realised that they weren't a commercial, as we call it, or no, a carcass. But when we came to the taste test, they all had distinctive different tastes. And quite a few of the people with restaurants at the taste test were really interested in the soya because it was so different to anything else. So I'll whip over now to the costings that we produced. So these slides will be available afterwards, but basically by using all the sheep and by using every bit of it, we actually came out with a much better profit than we originally thought of. So we already do this ourselves, but it's interesting to do it with all the different rare breeds. And it's like anything else, the rarer it is, the more it's wanted. So the wool and the skins from the rare breeds, primitives, sold really well and were really distinctive. So in effect, we proved that you know there was a really good profit to be made from basically fattening rare breed primitive wethers, and so it's sort of, a lot of people have small flocks, but then they don't breed from them because they have nowhere to get rid of the wethers. So this sort of proved that there is a really good market for the wethers, whether you fatten them yourselves or you sell them on for somebody else to fatten. So I'll hand over to Maria now, who's going to talk about the wool side of our business.
So yeah, I joined John on the farm maybe 8 years ago. I always get that wrong. And not coming from a farming background, it meant I looked at what the farm was producing maybe a bit differently. It's become normal for to think of wool as a waste product for the last few years. So I was thinking about what we could do with the wool. So I went to Wool Fest, which was very inspiring and full of wool connoisseurs who, a bit like people who are food connoisseurs, they want to know where the wool comes from, and they're looking for a breed specific wool which is more interesting than merino, which people just buy because it's soft. They were really looking at the different qualities that British breed wool has. So I looked at what we could do with our wool. Started very small, so that I wasn't taking much of a financial risk really in having our wool processed and selling it to the public. But if we go to the next slide, I think that will show you, these are some costings. So the first time I had wool processed was 20 kilos. So that wasn't very much, but that's a small amount that meant that I had 12 finished kilos to sell at the end of that process. And that shows you that we made £20 a kilo profit. These are all gross profit as well, not net profit. But it's just to show a comparison with what we've done on our farm. So that would, I think I wrote down here, yeah, so that gave us about £240 gross profit from that 20 kilos. I kind of carried on about that scale for quite a while, building up stock, not wanting to invest too much money. I'm not a knitter. You know, this was just a way to see if we could make a product that people would want and buy. So the next time when we did then scale up to 200 kilos, you can see that the profit has gone up to £35 a kilo. So that would have been around 3,850 profit for that year of the 200 kilo weight. And then again, this year we've just had 500 kilos processed, and that is £45 a kilo profit, which if we sell the whole lot, then it would be 12,600 profit. So that shows that when you scale up to that size, to that amount, it is that sort of profit margin is like a sort of part-time wage. But it's just an expensive process. Wool itself, the raw material, is incredibly cheap. It's just the other costs, especially the spinning costs, that really mean that you have to have some kind of capital to invest to get to that larger stage. But where we're at the moment is we got funding to get the 500 kilos processed from Farming and Protected Landscapes Fund through FIPL, which is called FIPL, and that's through the Lake District National Park. So that's been really good. So again, it means that we're not investing too much of our own money or asking the bank for a loan to develop these new income streams. And actually at the moment the Wool Board have really been very, very supportive in our business as it grows. And anyone who is interested in doing something with their wool, I would strongly recommend getting in touch with them. We're, as RBST, we're working towards making some breed-specific, gathering breed-specific yarn with the support of the Wool Board, so that we have a larger amount that can be sold to bigger organisations that are looking for breed-specific yarn from rare breeds. So that's a very exciting development in how they work. If we go to the next slide, so this is a Jersey cow that I have, Honeysuckle. So this was really not a business idea. I got her because I wanted to have raw milk on the farm, not realising how much milk she would produce. So even though we have a calf at foot system, she feeds her own calf, it's still too much milk. I have tried different things. I thought about making cheese, but that wasn't very good. And also the setup costs to start a dairy were, they were too big. I didn't want to invest too much money. So what I instead did was try making soap with excess milk, and because that's a long-lasting product, it's an easy thing to set up. You can start making it in your kitchen. And it was a good use of the excess milk. So if we go to the next slide, that kind of shows some of our costings. So to make 1 kilo soap is mainly oil and an alkaline solution in a liquid. The normal liquid would be water, but we use the milk, a small proportion of milk.
Most of the soaps that you buy in a shop aren't really soap. They're just the residue from making soap.
Well, yeah, because the process of making soap produces glycerin, but a lot of companies will take the glycerin out, sell that on to be, because that's a high value, that'll be used in other makeup products like lipstick. And so the waste bit that's left, that's sold as soap. So that's why it's often drying, but we don't take that out. So it means that it's a very good nourishing soap. So I just worked out the costings for 1 kilo block of soap, cost about £7, packaging and labour around £4. That makes 12 bars of soap at 80 grams, and we sell them for £7 each. Wholesale is obviously much less, about half of that. So if we weren't selling at wholesale and we were selling at retail at £7, and the profit would be £73 per kilo gross profit from that 100 grams of milk. And so again, that's turned into a profitable business for us. Soap sales last year, including all the other products I make, because I make different things now, was I think 60,000 sales. And then obviously they've got costs and everything as well, but it still meant that it's a good profitable business. That means that I can afford to have a member of staff working with me now. So yeah, selling direct is the largest profit margin. I mean, people find that on the farm as well, is that if you're selling the raw product, whether that's meat or the wool, to a merchant or through the auction, that's, you know, you're kind of bottom of the ladder in terms of the profit. So if we go to the next slide, so our UPS really is the scarce, yeah, USP. We have too many UPS deliveries. Is the scarcity of you know, having rare breeds or doing something different. For example, adding Jersey milk to the soap. Regionality is a big one. So the wool that we're producing at the moment, we're making Lake District tweed. So we're making Valley specific tweeds. So we'll have like a Coniston tweed and a Ullswater tweed. That's really interesting for people at the moment. Same with provenance. And using rare breeds, you've got a kind of instant brilliant story because they each have a great history. There's so much you can say about every single British breed, and just being a sort of specialist in that area and learning how to be a specialist. The good thing from my background, although it's not a farming background, it's an art background, I guess the training that was useful was if you have an idea for something and you don't know anything about it, you don't just sort of leave it, you just research and learn how to do it and you become a sort of specialist. So that's the thing it gave me, I guess it gave me the confidence just to try things, which you do as an artist. You don't really see things as a failure if they don't work. It's just, you know, something to learn from and you do the next thing. So these for us are really important, but everyone's situation will be very different. And so I guess I didn't want people to look at what we're doing and think, well, we can't do that because of this and this and this reason. You'll have your unique situation and your unique skills that will be able to enhance what you already have on your farm. So
I must add that when Maria started making soap, she was an extremely good baker, and I don't get any cakes now, so I'm really thin. She makes soap instead.
Yeah, no, soap's very like cake making. So again, it's not that I knew how to make soap and thought I'll turn that. It's not like that was my hobby and I'll turn it into a business. It's more that just looking at what we had, what the potential was for each bit of our business, and how we could develop it.
So just to wrap it all up, recently I took part in some Prince's Trust work on benchmarking on farms in this area. So they did benchmarking study on 25 farms on their financial records and stuff for 2 years ago. And it was interesting to look. So our farm was in the top 10 when it came to gross margins out of 25 farms. But even more interesting was when this is taking BPS out of the equation. So basically the figures were done not using, so as if you weren't getting any BPS. And even more interesting when they looked at actually the costings once labour was involved, and we were in the top 5, and the 2 of the top 5 from the original one went right to the bottom of the queue because they were very, very labour intensive dairy farms where basically they were running around trying to make a living and spending all the time. So one lesson that we've learned, which is the fact that you don't have to work like a Trojan to actually make money, and actually having time to sit back and look at your business and go for a walk. And when we go for a walk with with the dogs, we're usually discussing what we're going to do next with our business or new projects. But there seems to be this concept in farming that unless you're covered in muck and working like a Trojan, then you're not a farmer. And I think that's something we really have to look at. As it's not a very good thing, really, in the farming world. So we'll pass you over to Andrea now, and thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Maria. That was fascinating, inspirational stuff, and some very good pointers for us all in there. And so next, I will hand you over to Andrea Parry-Jones. Andrea's conservation advisor and farms on Anglesey. Andrea, over to you.
So I'm Andrea. I'm going to talk about how we can use the rare breeds and native breeds with conservation grazing and habitat management. A lot of people believe that conservation grazing in some manner is you find the most primitive type of animal they can find, with the least type of management, and they can just turn them out and hope for the best, which isn't what conservation grazing is about. Our native and rare breeds are especially suited to conservation grazing because they're adapted to the British environment. Most are regionally developed breeds, which were developed to meet needs in each of those regions, and those adaptations can then be applied to different areas of the UK with a similar climate or similar habitat. With conservation grazing, usually what the aim is to preserve a habitat that is already in existence, whereas when they're used in management, it would normally be used either to manage scrub encroachment, potentially to thin out the understory of canopy, or increasingly they're being used on reclaimed industrial sites. And so old quarries, as well as also in semi-new rewilding projects, where essentially they are replacing animals that are no longer in existence. So there's quite a few projects at the moment using longhorns. There's a few starting to use traditional Herefords, and they're looking at replicating ecological impacts that would have been in existence in a landscape several thousand years ago. Well, one thing that's really important with conservation grazing and ecological management in general is to know what the aims of the project are. So if we can swap the next slide. So some conservation grazing projects or habitat management projects evolve from an idea. Some are based with Natural England, English Stewardship, Countryside Council for Wales, NRW, or large landowners or small landowners who want to make a difference to their biodiversity, to increase hedgerows, to reclaim industrial sites. So what they need to do is they need to know what they're aiming to do with the site. So do they want to conserve the habitat that's already there? Are they looking to preserve a rare species of flora or fauna? Is there a specific bird that they're looking to preserve? Do they need nesting sites? Are they looking to control weeds that tend to become a monoculture? With habitat management, what we're tending to find when we're doing consulting pitches and when we're being asked to help various landowners is that they're looking to manage a site less intensively. They're looking to manage a site without mechanical intervention. So there's been an increase in using equines, various sizes, from Exmoor ponies through to, in a couple of cases, using heavy horses to try and replicate the same environmental impacts as a large herbivore such as an elephant would create. That particular project itself is fairly unique. There haven't been many trying to use heavy horses in that manner. I think there is another one that's considering it. Or if you're looking to create a habitat, so by having large herbivores or small herbivores within a habitat that hasn't previously had them, or has been left to go to seed, or has been part of a rewilding project, or is only grazed on very low density, or barely grazed at all. It may only be grazed for 1 or 2 months of the year. Bare patches of ground created by large herbivores, poaching created, they create microhabitats and add to that habitat mosaic of them. So, for instance, using pigs, they can create habitat by rooting. but then certain breeds will also create habitat by grazing, used in conjunction with other species. As in the photo of the Norfolk horn in a woodland. The actual aim of that habitat was to project was to manage some of the carpet of ivy, which was actually encroaching onto the pasture land. What that landowner actually found was that those Norfolk horns preferred the woodland to the actual pasture, which wasn't what they were quite expecting. But those sheep had obviously found a better niche there than they had in their original intended habitat. And if we go to the next slide. So it's important with conservation grazing to use the right species for your aim. You wouldn't put, say, a small Boré sheep into a project where you were looking at increasing poaching, where you were looking at potentially increasing habitat impact on large amounts of scrub, or within woodland, or within extending the boundary of pasture into woodland. You would look at using something like cattle, potentially equines, or potentially, if you are, in some cases, some breeds of pig have been used as well. Hence the belted Galloways that are in the top corner there, they are used in multiple sites across the country, and they are used in conservation grazing projects right the way through from the top of the Peak District and through to grazing pasture land down in Northamptonshire, where they are being used between woodland patches of woodland and old permanent pasture. They're suited to most environments. They're very hardy. Then you've got the photo of the English goat. These aren't used as much as yet. They are increasing in popularity, mainly due, it appears to be due to becoming on the watch list. These goats they contain quite a lot of sheep-eater blood in some cases. They're hardy and they are very good browsers, and they're not as fussy as some species and some breeds of goats, and will selectively browse, but they will take quite a lot of different plant life. Again, you wouldn't necessarily want to use those on a nice pasture. With them being English goats, it's quite likely, as one of our landowners found out, that they will decide that they don't need to be in that pasture anymore, and they will find them in about 3 miles down the road in Orchard. And ponies are often used everywhere from moorland through to increasing within woodland and anywhere in between. You wouldn't necessarily want to put equines or large breed cattle on somewhere which is very heavy soil, very heavy clay, somewhere that is going to damage the landscape more than it's going to create reasonable habitat and help increase the biodiversity. The Portland sheep there, that's an example of being grazed on sand dunes. They are used there because it's very open. That's not the sort of environment that you'd put something like a Teeswater or maybe a Cotswold, because they're the wrong type of sheep. And right in the bottom corner, I'm not sure if you can see properly, but those are some middle whites grazing in some woodland. They had previously had Tamworths in that particular area, but found that the fencing wasn't quite suitable. So what they decided to do was change the breed. So when you're looking at what species to use, not only do you need to take into account the habitat, you need to take into account what interaction is going to be with the public. Is there going to be a lot of public access? Is there likely to be public feeding from the public? Is there a lot of dog walking? Somewhere which has high traffic for canines may not be somewhere that you'd be looking to have sheep or goats, or potentially even pigs. If there's public access, you need to look at whether or not you're going to allow mares to foal. Some mares can become protective. It's not something that happens on a regular basis, but it's not something you'd want to chance to the general public. And then again, you also need to consider, if you're going to have cows calving, is there public access, or is there likely to be any access with dogs? Are there bridleways? Recently, there's been a few issues where ponies have been used for conservation grazing in some places, and stallions have been present. Bridleways haven't been notified, which has luckily not ended in any accidents. But you need to take into account where the species is going and the whole environment. What are the risks of the environment? You know, are there sheer cliff faces? Is it a floodplain? If it is a floodplain, is it somewhere that you're likely to get warning, or is it somewhere where you're likely to get no warning at all? In which case, do you need to terminate grazing earlier than you would on other land? But it's not just the species that you need to consider. You also need to consider the breed that you want for the job that you want to do. If we can change to the next slide. So different breeds within each species are quite capable of doing different jobs. If you look at just within the sheep breeds, the variation from the hill sheep through to the long wools and the down breeds, each of them has a different grazing and browsing habit. You can combine, if you don't want to combine species, you can always combine breeds. We've run several projects where we've combined primitive, hill and heath, and long wool breeds. It's not recommended, of course, to put long wool breeds anywhere that's full of briars or in any, you know, it's not recommended for any animal to be put in unsuitable habitat at all. So one of the projects that was used was Portlands combined with Norfolk Horns and Whiteface Woodlands. So this particular project was to see whether or not the grazing structure would be altered by having 3 particular breeds of sheep of different sizes from different habitats. What was found from the behaviour of these animals was that the Portlands were favouring the browse, whereas the woodlands, despite having access to grass, were favouring the rush. The Norfolks, they would go for the sweeter grasses. So having a combination of breeds was able to add more structure to the grazing that was available. These breeds were there for a set amount of time. So they were removed, I think it was around Christmas period. And then the following year they grazed at the same time. What was observed was that there was definitely on regrowth an increase in the biodiversity in the species that were present. Another project was run was combining Old English goats with English and with Golden Guernseys. And what was found in that particular project, the Guernseys were much more likely to graze than either of the other 2 breeds, both of which were much more prone to browse. And when observed in particular weather conditions, the Old English were more likely to be out in hard weather, whereas the others would be likely to be sheltering. So it's not just the species that you need to consider, it's also the breed. And our native breeds and our rare breeds are the best tools that we've got for ecological management without too much, without mechanical intervention. There's so many different functions that they provide. They are the perfect ecosystem engineers. So the goat that's in the photo is an English goat. That particular project was run with over 13 acres with a group of 15. And that was a reclaimed quarry. The idea for that particular goat project was that the understory needed thinning out, and there was a water meadow present. And there is a photo of this at the end of the presentation. And that particular, because it hadn't been grazed in about 15 years prior to the quarry being used, it had dried out. It was very monoculture, and what the landowner was looking to do was to hit some biodiversity targets that they'd been given in order to receive some funding. So those goats were run over that land for a period of 10 months. And what was used was different life stages. So not only do you need to think of your species and your breed, you need to think of what life stage is to have complete social interaction and to have complete behavioral interaction with the environment. You need different life stages. So this herd contained 1 matriarch, she was around 10-year-old, 2 beta females, some subordinate males, a dominant male, and some kids of that year. When they were introduced, what was found was that the billy goats, they tended to roam further, so they were less selective in their browsing. The matriarch and the betas tended to favour sycamore, which we found quite interesting at the time. Whereas the youngsters tended to go for more softer browse, so nettles, ivy, dock, thistle. They were going for easier to access feedstuffs. At the end of the project, they were removed, and a survey was done the following growing period, it was found the rushes didn't particularly return in the 2 paddocks that they were worried about, but the irises that returned did grow to circa 5 foot tall, as they found when they put in a couple of ponies next door and they went through the fence and they couldn't find a 15-2. They measured about 5 foot. The worry with goats mainly is usually that they will ring trees and that they will kill a lot of the plant life. On this particular site, there was only 4 trees lost. 2 were sycamore, 1 was an old hawthorn, and the other one, they believe, was probably on the way out. Yeah, and if we can pop to the next slide. Another thing, one thing that is becoming more popular is multi-species grazing. And this is something that was first trialled many, many moons ago. What's being found more and more with multi-species grazing is not only are you getting the benefits of having a smaller parasite burden, but also that the species to species interaction is actually not only allowing the animals to express natural behaviors, but also allowing the animals to create symbiotic relationships. So what we have a site at the moment which currently has some middle white pigs, some equines, and some sheep. It's stocked at about 0.3 livestock units per acre. And what has been seen is that where the pigs haven't rooted until autumn, so they've spent most of the time predominantly grazing. The equines then have followed the pigs, which was quite interesting to see. Where they have rooted, the equines are then using those as secondary wallows themselves. The sheep haven't really bothered with either of the other species. However, it has been noted that the areas where the sheep tend to rest more, where it has become poached, is where the pigs have then tended to root. So this particular project, what the landowner wanted to do was widen some of the ditches without having mechanical intervention. It's bordering on triple SI, and the worry was that if mechanical intervention happened, then that would actually damage more of the habitat than conserve the waterfalls that they were trying to conserve. So by using the combination of the equines, the pigs and the sheep have kept the parasite burden lower for the equines. They've also kept on top of some of the rushes. The breeds that we used were hill breeds, very hardy breeds. It's a very open landscape with minimal shelter. Shelter was provided for the pigs, and the equines had access to a runoff field, which has shelter of about 5 foot wall. There is public footpaths, which is why cattle weren't used at this point. Over the other side to that particular project, cattle are used. However, they use a combination of ancient cattle of Wales and Dexters. They did find, however, that some were getting fairly reactive to the local dog population, so they decided not to use them on this side of the walls. So what's actually happened, the project is ongoing until next year, and the ditches have been successfully widened. They've noted that they have more water voles in the last survey that they've done, and they've managed to not only maintain that habitat, but also by the rooting of the pigs, they've actually disturbed the seedbed, and that seedbed is then hopefully going to germinate into the same sort of seed bank as the following field, which is quite it's a very mixed, very heavy seed bank of various wildflowers and water plants. Previously, this field was quite intensively grazed, so hopefully the disturbance by the pigs will also help with that. And if we pop the next one. So these slides show these are some photos of some of the effects of using our rare and native breeds within conservation, grazing and habitat management. So the bottom photo was a disused quarry. That one particularly was used with some Bagot goats, and that's also been used for some Old English goats on a later date. What they wanted to do was maintain some open areas while allowing the scrub to encroach. One of the reasons that these two breeds are particularly suited for that management is they are hardy, they are primitive type, primitive types do tend to need sometimes less management. Some of the other more high maintenance breeds, you wouldn't want to necessarily use you wouldn't use a high production animal for this type of project. The photo in the bottom right, left, I'm useless with both those, with the irises, that is the regrowth from the project and disused quarry. The woodland behind is also where Norfolk Horns had previously been run. They've noticed that biodiversity is increased quite a lot. They've got a lot more small mammals now that the under canopy's been opened up more, and a lot of the ivy and the bracken that was choking a lot of the other plant life has gone. They've got a lot higher owl population than they did have. They've noticed that they've got more bats than they did have. Although the one thing they have seen is they had a decline in moths, but I'm not sure if that is something that's the area in general at the moment. So the other photos are a sequence of photos which come from a project which is still ongoing. The top photo was after the land was minimally grazed with Exmoor ponies. It was then left dormant for a year. It was cut for hay. Then some Welsh ponies were introduced alongside some low density sheep. And you can see that the structure of the grazing is changing. There was 3 breeds of sheep introduced, all of which graze at different levels, and they all have different browsing and grazing preferences. So then the photo at the bottom, that is the same field about 6 weeks later. So that is still being grazed, the equines are still present, and the sheep are still present on a lower density. At this point, some goats were introduced. The goats that were introduced in this project were Golden Guernseys, as they tend to have a preference to graze rather than browse. The top photo, which for some reason is showing a black square for me, I can't see. That, as I can't see, I can't describe, unfortunately. The photo, including the wildflowers, is the project which had the pigs, ponies, goats, and sheep present. So that was the result from being intensively grazed with Welsh mountain sheep up until the 31st of March. It was then left with minimal livestock density. So that was a 0.2 livestock unit density for the entirety of the year, and that was the density of the grazing by the end of July. So these photos show that our native and our rare breeds are the perfect tools to use as ecosystem engineers. It may be that you need to look at a breed that potentially isn't what you thought. So, for instance, there is a project where some long wools have been used on sand dunes. Those were used there to see whether or not the free draining ground would actually improve the foot issues that were being had in that particular flock, and those were resolved. However, it was also found that their productivity actually went up quite a lot. From the 3 years they've actually been on that particular set of grazing, they're on there from, I think it's from the March through to the December, they've actually scanned between 190 and 200% and lamb successfully, which according to the breed average is quite a lot higher than was previously thought. Again, there have been projects where inappropriate breeds have been used. So if anybody ever is in doubt, we are always, we can always help with stock for projects. We can always help, to find the right breed for a project. It may be that our primitive breeds are extremely popular for conservation grazing projects, and they are usually the go-to breeds of sheep. Exmoor ponies tend to be the go-to ponies, but all of our native breeds are perfectly capable of performing conservation grazing and habitat management duties. There are projects with fell ponies, highland ponies, dales. All of our native breeds have been used in some form or another. As I said, there are even some 1 or 2 projects using heavy horses, and not just for logging. They are using them to mimic certain ecological impacts that they're looking. Cattle are usually used quite extensively for conservation grazing. Again, depending on the impact that you're looking for, depends on the breed that you'd need to look at for the breed. Pig wise, again, Tamworth does tend to be one of the most popular breeds, but there are any of our breeds, as long as they suit the environment.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. That was absolutely fantastic. Your knowledge of the different grazing impacts of different breeds is incredible, and it's always useful to be reminded that sheep aren't just an environmental bad. We've all heard talk about sheep wrecking and woolly maggots and the like, but in fact, sheep can make their own valuable contribution, helping to create or restore many of the habitats that we all cherish and want to save or bring back. Anyway, it's about 10 to. We've got a bit of time for questions, so I will go on to those now. A lot of familiar names as well. I think probably the first question I think this is for Maria. Maria, how and where are you selling your yarn?
Mainly I'm selling it online, just because doing small amounts means it's, when I started anyway, doing the smaller amounts, it meant that having that margin available to sell it wholesale to wool shops wasn't really there. So I just sell it online myself, and then I do a few wool shows. Obviously, because of lockdown, there hasn't been very many, but I did start up a wool show of my own called the Farmers' Yarns, and that was specifically for farmers that make the most of their wool, make wool products, or sell, say, sheepskins. And that went really, really well. And also are other producers that bought wool directly from a farmer to make yarn. So that's why I just worked specifically with people that were using buying direct and selling wool with provenance. And that went really, really well. We had a brilliant turnout for a first time show. It was great. So I'll carry on doing that. But yeah, normally I've done Woolfest and another couple of shows, but there's so many yarn shows now, they're so popular. It's a good way to sell because although we do sell online, people really like to be able to squeeze the wool, and they'll buy more once they've squeezed it.
It is critical to get to the right market though, because at first Maria went to 1 or 2 wool shows where there was loads of acrylic wool that was that was selling for 20p, and Maria's was quite much. So it is good to do some research and look at the market, but doing actual sort of physical markets to start off with does build up your customer base, and then they will start buying online. And some people follow leaders, don't they? So that if somebody buys your wool, then somebody else will see it, and then so Instagram and things like that are your big friends, really.
Yeah, and so I know that it's tricky for farmers that maybe don't have, a particularly large flock of sheep to do stuff with their wool, or they don't want to invest, or they don't want to do the marketing. It is tricky to put all of those hats on and be all of those people. So I'm working with another woman who has a PhD in British wool, and we are working more to be the kind of a bit like a mini wool merchant that can kind of work with farmers, maybe buy their wool, and work with brands, so kind of connecting brands with fashion brands with farmers and paying farmers a decent price.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have a question from Della, who is asking about sources of information on the grazing habits of different sheep breeds. Well, Della, there's quite a lot on the RBST website. If you go into the grazing resources section, over the years we've done quite a lot of work on this, as you've probably gathered from what Andrea's been saying, and we run a thing called the Grazing Animals Project. This is something that was started probably 20 years ago with us, Natural England, and a few other ENGOs, most of whom have fallen by the wayside, but we've persevered with it, and I say the materials I think are there. Andrea, is there anywhere else that's particularly useful as a way of finding out about the grazing impacts and habits of different sheep breeds?
What people have been doing is emailing me, to be honest. There's quite a few people that have sent emails in asking various breeds, because some of the breeds are missing from the gap materials because they hadn't been used at the time. So if there's anything particular, I can try and help.
And you can be contacted through the RBST website.
Yep.
Okay. Question from Monica, probably for you, Andrea. How does a landowner decide which species, breeds, or combinations to use?
We've helped quite a few landowners. They've come to us and asked for help. So it depends on what the aim is. So first thing is you decide what the aim of the project is, whether or not you're looking to create habitat, conserve habitat, or manage the habitat that's already there. From there, we would then look at what species would be best, and then looking at the land that you've got, the conditions, you'd then have a look at which breeds that you'd need that would be able to thrive and survive there, and hopefully create some form of income as well.
That's great, thank you. Yes, and as Andrea says, we are a charity. We're there to go and provide support and help to people keeping native breeds or who are interested in doing so. We can provide a certain amount of advice for free, but we also offer a consultancy service, particularly for those who are new to keeping native breeds or are doing so at scale. We can advise you on what breeds might be appropriate for a particular location or habitat, and help you source them and give some guidance on the management of them going forward over the longer time. If that's of interest, again, do get in touch through the website. Another question, again, this is probably for Andrea, from Joe Cartwright. Are there any breeds of pigs which are less likely to root or destroy? Exclamation mark.
Usually, pigs destroy less if they've got more access. So large blacks are known as very good grazers. We found with middle whites, they didn't really tend to start rooting until mid-October or later. So depending on the size of the plot that you're looking at putting them would depend on the stocking density and how high likely they are to start rooting. Tamworths very much like rooting, and Berkshires fairly enjoy rooting. But some of the more grazing type breeds, so the large blacks, the Oxfords, depending on the conditions, they seem to like to graze in pastures that are quite rough or quite very herbal lays, but are quite happy to root as well. We had 2 Oxfords running on about 3 acres. They rooted 2 patches, one of which actually turned out to be an underground spring that we didn't know about, which was actually really handy. But they didn't make a particular mess, and they were there all winter and for the summer. However, seven middle whites on 35 acres since October have turned over about 2.5 acres, which isn't particularly a lot, but if they were in a smaller plot, then obviously it would make a fair amount of mess.
Okay, and next one again for you, Andrea. Have you identified any specific environmental factors that have led you to the amazing increase in productivity of the longhorns that you mentioned?
Longhorns or long wools?
The question is longhorns. Perhaps the intended reference should have been long wools.
Yeah, the long wools, not as yet. That's something that is going to be recorded this year. So the scanning rate's been recorded for the last 2 years, and the lambing rate. I think the plan this year is to blood test them after lambing, because they're fairly close to lambing, to see if there's anything particular that's changed from a blood test that was done when they looked to be fairly deficient or having foot issues a few years back. So hopefully we can then potentially use any data towards the Love a Long Wool campaign, and hopefully maybe look at some other breeds.
Okay. Do you want to say a little bit about our Love a Long Wool campaign now you've mentioned it?
Yeah, so the Love a Long Wool campaign concentrates on the British long wool breeds, promoting them both for conservation grazing in the appropriate habitat, for commercial purposes, for their wool, for their meat, for their fleece. There's quite a few non-slaughter flocks and fibre flocks that have been set up in the last few years for the long wools. There's been a big increase, especially over COVID and with crafting, and there's definitely a lot more interest via spinners and needle felting, things like that. But some of the long wool breeds definitely need a hand. They are, some of them are very hardy. They are very commercial. They do make good crossing sires. hopefully this year we will get some data together commercially, and then we can help promote it more.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, not sorry, but another question for you, I think. Where do rare livestock species come from? That sounds profound. Also, do you ever have a problem with surplus stock where the project is over and livestock need to be taken off the land?
There's flocks and herds of various livestock all over the country. If somebody's interested in sourcing them, we can always help. And if we can't, we can direct them to any breed society can also help. Most of the rare breeds do have a commercial purpose. So surplus stock either will go, if it meets breed standard, will go with breeding stock. Sometimes we'll go with crossing stock for non-pedigree animals. Go to slaughter and produce meat. Some people do buy them for fibre flocks and non-slaughter flocks. Equine wise, sometimes I have known landowners have had an issue if they have young colts and finding new homes for them, but they have found that generally by gelding these individuals that there is more of an opportunity to find homes for them. Livestock wise, worst comes to worst, they can always go to a market. Equine wise, the recommendation usually is to geld the colts, and then hopefully they'll be able to find a home.
That's great. Again, I'm probably for you, Andrea. This is from Francesca Cooper, who has belted Galloways and some Berkshire pigs on a mixed regenerative farm and is going to be working on a rewilding project managed by Wildlife Trust. She asks, do people charge for this service, or is it generally done for free?
For which service?
Sorry, I assume the Francesca means offering her livestock to the Wildlife Trust for their project. Should she expect the Wildlife Trust to pay for that? I don't know. Francesca, are you on the call? Would you like to go and ask it yourself if I've got the wrong end of the stick?
Some people do charge for using their livestock. There was a couple of people in Carmarthenshire that were charging for the use of goats. I'm aware that of some people charging a couple of wildlife trusts in England for grazing land, but generally, as far as I'm aware, it's not usually charged for. But if they do offer payment, I wouldn't necessarily say no.
On the bits that I do, I get the land for free basically, but I do insist that they look the animals. So, but if you're having to go and look the animals, then you definitely should be charging, because you know it is a lot of time and expense. But if they've took over the actual looking at the animals, then I don't usually charge. That's my experience anyway.
And around here, they tend to expect they've got some chap that goes and checks them, but then they would, they try and get you to pay for it anyway around here because land's quite scarce at the minute. But in other places, not quite so much.
So it just sort of shows the regional diversity and presumably different pressures on land in different parts of the country. Next, a question on goats from Brian Jones, who would like to keep them, but has problem with getting them to respect boundaries. Brian's managed to train sheep to respect fencing. Do you think goats can be trained in the same way?
They can be, but you tend to need a much more powerful energizer for goats. I think we've got a 7 or 8 dual energizer for the goats, or no fence have bought out collars for use on sheep and goats, which work out cheaper than the cattle collars. So that might be an option, as goats are more intelligent than sheep that I've found so far. I might be wrong. That using the collars might be a way to get them to respect the fencing, or if not, we've found it's a 7 or 8 dual energizer to keep them in.
Okay. Next, I have a comment from Jane Cooper, who I know many of you will know as through Twitter from Orkney Borere, who is an excellent example of what can be done to conserve, well, obviously borrow-raise in this case, through exploiting the commercial benefits. And she reminds us that anyone selling wool from British sheep breeds can have an entry on the Woolsack website, and it's free. She's been running it for some time, and if you're interested, just contact her through that website. Okay, going through. Next question from Joe Cartwright. Are there any breeds that like rushes? Andrea first.
My Highland ponies I found will favour rushes even when there's grass there. My white-faced woodlands are quite happy to do the same. Welsh Mountains are quite happy to do the same. And the Welsh Mountain pedigree is on our priority list. Most people don't believe that the Welsh Mountain's on there, but the pedigree one definitely is. The Todwen, we've got some Todwens on at the moment. They're quite happy to eat the rushes, as we found with the Manx Loptons.
John, any experience of things that take rushes?
Yeah, as Andrew said, ponies are the best. Well, any horses love rushes, but I find that especially if you've topped them once, then the younger shoots, the sort of more primitive breeds of sheep or cattle will eat them pretty happily. When they're old and tough and full of dead stuff, they're not as appetizing. But any of the primitive breeds are definitely ponies.
Okay, comment from Joe Cartwright, who has saddlebacks that seem to root rather than graze, so maybe she's going to be switching breeze. And Francesca Cooper is delighted to hear that she can charge for grazing stock, which is nice to hear. Yep, backing up saying that should charge. And Jane again, Jane Cooper, Orkney Moray, one of her flocks does conservation grazing for the RSPB. They get to cut hay from an area of land, and that's the payment for the grazing service. Joe had to pay, so I'm sort of scrolling forward to go and see if there's any more questions coming through. Some charities are thinking about taking land back to claim subsidies. Yes, I think that actually is a factor, and I'm sensing that with the new Elm scheme that there'll be a number of landowners who are taking land back in hand, which is going to be a concern for many smaller people. James Allen comments, the biggest problem with the conservation grazing industry is that people don't charge. Yes, the landowners are often getting higher subsidies for the grazing being on the site. Why should they not pay? Landowners pay people to come and cut their hedges, they can claim. Yes, I mean, quite right, I agree, as does Francesca. I'm not going to go and read out all the comments because that'll take forever, and I'm sure you can see them. I'm just going to go and flick through for the question.
I think the conservation grazing, I think it depends on who you're working with and how much they do for you. Like one firm that I do, they built me a new set of pens. They look after all the stock, they move them and everything, and I cut hay there. Whereas another place where they don't do much, then I actually, I'm not as keen to graze, if you know what I mean. So I think a lot of it depends on the relationship you have with the customer, as you might say.
I think it depends as well how scarce the land is. I know around here, a couple of conservation grazing sites have actually gone through the local auctioneer, and the person that's actually conservation grazing them is actually paying for the land as well as only being allowed to stock it with a certain type of sheep, certain number and certain days of the year.
Okay, and Della reminds us there was, going back to the uses of native breeds, particularly sheep, that felting is also an option. Maria, John, do you see your business, either of the strands of the businesses, developing in any particular way, and if so, how?
Well, we're always sort of developing different strands. What we tend to do is start out small and do something, see if it works, and then go from there. And what we've always done is sort of reinvested money into the projects. The big change, as Maria said, has been the Farming and Protected Landscapes grant fund. So we applied to that to do the Lake District Tweed project, which has given us a lot more capital to actually move faster. Otherwise we've had to move a lot slower, because as we showed in the figures, investing in getting wool produced is very, very expensive. So and plus it's a very slow turnover, where with the soap you've got quite a fast turnover. You're making less for each item, but you've got really fast turnover. So it's only on the shelf a month, 6 weeks, whereas the wool, you're looking at a year to 2 years from actually shearing the fleece to getting a product back, and then hopefully selling it. So you've got much longer turnover investment. I know at one time we were looking at our figures and thinking, well, we're doing all this work, where's all the money? And we realised we had £50,000 worth of wool sat in the front room. So,
but definitely moving forward, I think the soap is a nice little business that's ticking along. I don't necessarily want to grow it, but I have been invited to help set up with India Hamilton, who I think might still be on this call, to help set up a soap making business using goat milk in Nepal, which will be very exciting. So I don't necessarily want to grow the business so that we sell soap to Tesco or anything like that. I kind of like it being at this scale. But the wool is definitely growing. There's so much more interest. There's a lot of excitement around British wool. So you're seeing more and more designers using British wool. Even Victoria Beckham has got some knitwear in British wool now, which is great. But that next stage is definitely knowing where that wool comes from. Exactly the same with how food has gone with, selling food with a provenance. It's wool with a provenance as well. So that's definitely I see that as a really exciting growth market for farmers. And so I'm really excited about growing that side of it.
While we're on the subject of soap, a couple more questions, Maria. Firstly, would you be willing to go and provide a recipe for soap, or is that part of your intellectual property which you wouldn't want to disclose? And sorry, yes.
Yeah. Would you be able to provide? There's so many recipes for soap. Of course, I can provide a recipe for soap, but to sell it, even if you use my recipe, you would still have to have a safety assessment that's under your name, that you are licensed to make that soap and sell it. So that's one thing, but I think that's actually, it's really good because I've sent to chemists a recipe that I would like to make as a soap, and they've said, well, you can't use that essential oil at that percentage because it's too high. So it's very, very good. I know that then when I'm making the soap to the recipe that's been assessed by a chemist, that's safe to use. Is it worth noting soap is basically regulated and needed data sheet? Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's really
so each recipe needs a testing, and once you've had that verified, then you can use that recipe as many times as you want. But if you make the slightest little change to it, then
you have to have another assessment.
So at the moment, a lot of the products are getting very expensive. So Maria's been looking at using perhaps different products. Well, that'll need a different data sheet because it's come from a different supplier. And
yeah, but it's not particularly expensive. It's fine.
Who grants the approvals?
You can just look for you just look online for cosmetic safety assessments, and there's different chemists that do that as a service. There's seems to be an awful lot, and they can take months. There's so much demand for them. But yeah, they can take months to get your. So you can't kind of develop a new product and then launch it a week later. It takes quite a long time. Yeah.
Della was asking about the fund that you mentioned. I assume that was the Farming in Protected Landscapes Fund.
Yeah.
John, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's basically limited to national parks and AONBs. So in effect, it's money that's come out of the BPS and then is being filtered back through to improve. The grants are mostly for innovation to change the way agriculture is being done, and for anything that's sort of saving carbon, to do with cultural heritage and access. So there's various things you can look at, but if you're not in an AONB or a national park, it's not available at the moment, but it has seemed to be quite successful, I think. So they're on about actually expanding it. But
Yes, that's my impression. I'm even been aware of that budget, that funding pot being used to sustain the sort of abattoirs we need that will process small numbers of non-standard animals. Jane again talks about the number of small farms producing their own wool and that, how important provenance is. And again, I think that just backs up what's already been said.
Yeah, the big thing on that is that the wool board's changed its views very much, where they were sort of saying, sending out letters saying, you know, you can't do this. Now they're saying, yes, carry on and do it, because you know, they're wanting more wool to get used rather than you know, getting thrown away. Or you know, they're actually encouraging it now, whereas before they were seemed quite against it.
Yeah, so John, I think at one point when he worked for the National Trust, was using Herdwick wool for fixing paths, and he was asked, he got a letter from the wool board saying you can't use it, you know, you have to buy it back from the wool board. But yeah, there's another question here, I think from who was that, Joe Cartwright. When selling wool, the rule of selling to British wool has changed. So yeah, by law it does say that you have to sell all of your wool to British wool, but that's definitely changed now. They wouldn't kind of you know, as in the past it was, John was told that he had to buy it from British wool. That is definitely changing, but we are working with British wool so that we will still, so even though in the past I've just been using our own wool, selling it, sending it to get processed, now I will be sending it the wool to British wool to be graded, and from there have it washed. So I'm working within their system so I can use their accreditation and be a licensee. So that helps. So although I'm paying, I'll still pay farmers direct a higher price, but also I'll be paying the wool board for grading the wool. So that helps other farmers. So it's not just sort of kind of taking away business from them. So they've still got plenty of wool that they'll sell in their markets, but it's working with them to develop, I guess, another way of working which is more in line with how consumers and manufacturers are changing and what they want from British wool.
Actually, as Jane points out, rare breeds have always been exempt from British wool board rules, as are certain small and regional projects. And she makes a very sensible point that if you're in any doubt, get in touch with British wool. And certainly I think our collective experience is that they've been incredibly helpful. You know, we've spent quite a lot of time reminding that we pay a levy in just the same way as the big boys do, and ought to get some service back. And certainly the new chief executive has been incredibly helpful in helping us better promote the wool from the sort of breeds that we care about. And I see that Della does live in a protected area, and so is happy that she can apply for football money. I think it's an annual thing, isn't it, John?
Well, you can just apply anytime you want, but it's best to get advice, because there's a scoring system, and if you don't get above a certain score, you don't go forward to the next stage. So it's definitely worth getting advice. I actually sit on the board that gives out money, so I have a bit more inside information, and some very, very poor applications have come forward, but the ones that have sort of worked with the grant giving body are much better.
Okay, to which Dilla responds, whoop whoop. Okay, I've got a request for help. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, but no more questions. John, Maria, do you quickly want to sum up a couple of top tips for anyone thinking of keeping native breeds? What should you think about before going down that route, and what should you think about in terms of the economic opportunities, or how to make the best of the economic opportunities?
I think just backing up what Andrea said, that you need the right my breed as well as the right species. We've got a number of breeds, and some we've found haven't suited our system or our land. We're very, very wet. So, you know, we have lots of woods and stuff. So we have a flock of Teeswaters, which we're now going to get rid of because they're just too much like hard work. Although the wool's fantastic, among woodland, and they don't seem to like the wet ground either very much. So again, it's, you know, it's trying things and make sure that, and there's no breed doesn't need looking after. A few people get this idea that, you know, I've got a primitive native breed that they'll just look after themselves. Well, yes, to a certain degree, but they still need, you know, care and welfare and looking after. You can't just chuck them out in the field and expect them to live and do well. And I think the other thing is sort of looking back at your business every now and then and just seeing what's working and what's not working. Too many people get so engrossed in the actual farming and being out in all weathers and actually don't take time to look at their business and, you know, A, whether they're enjoying it, and B, whether it's actually bearing fruit. So, you know, analyze what you're doing every now and then and make sure that you know, you're doing the right thing.
Okay, so another specific question from Joe. In fact, two questions we've had in. John, Maria, do you cross any of your natives, or are they all pure?
Yeah, no, we cross quite a lot of the natives. So we just breed pure from the best examples. We have got quite high numbers, so that makes it much easier. So, you know, we lamb about just short of 500 sheep, and I have like 50 cows. So we tend to cross the ones that aren't as good. And we find that, you know, especially crossing the primitives, you get fantastic maternal dams from them. So we breed Castle Blues, which is a Castle Milk Cross Blueface Leicester, and we sell them. You know, people love them. And
they've got an amazing perfect fleece, because a Castle Milk fleece, a pure Castle Milk fleece, is a very short staple. So it's actually quite hard for the spinners. So we would always, when we were getting, as Jane said, a lot of the wool is blended to get exactly what you want. So I would, if I was having Castle Milk Murret made into yarn, I would blend it with Blueface Leicester. So we just crossed them, so we didn't need to blend the wool. We could send it in pure, and it does make a beautiful, beautiful sheep. We use a black Blueface Leicester because then we get an amazing dark chocolate fleece from them.
And then with the cattle, I cross some of the cattle as well. So yeah.
You've got sort of white bred.
Yeah, white bred shorthorns, and they're quite small when they calve, and they're short gestation period. So I use the white bred shorthorn bull on other heifers because it just it makes it easy calving. So, but we only have native breeds. You don't have any non-native breeds. So.
John, another question I think for you from Hannah, who is asking how she can get help with making a FIPL application. Where would you go if you wanted help?
So you should get help from either your national park or your ONB. So on their website, or they should have information on who you should contact to apply. Some people have actually employed people to do that role. Some ONBs have actually got people in to facilitate it, so a company to facilitate it. But if you look on your local site, there should be some link to the FIPL bid system.
So obviously John, because he's on the board, he could sit on my application. But two people from Lake District National Park came out to meet me. I told them about 5 ideas, and all of them were fine. But I just put in an application for 3 of them. One was the wool, one was to make a wool store in a converter barn to make a wool store, and one was to buy a chiller trailer so that other farmers and ourselves could use it mainly for poultry. So people keeping small amounts of poultry who wanted to butcher them themselves, because it's quite hard to find anyone to do that, and to have a sort of clean environment to do it in, so that it's easier to sell it on to the public. And also say it can hang lambs or a beast as well. So it's quite a nice thing for people to be able to hire and start out if they're just starting to sell meat direct. It's it's a clean space to do it in, so you're not having to do it in your kitchen.
Yeah, and there's different rates of payment. So if you're making, you know, if it's a commercial piece of equipment that you're going to be able to sell on at the end or make money out of, then it's 40%. Then there's 60%, 80%, and 100%, depending on you know, the different levels of if you're going to make any money or if you're not, or whether it's a public good thing or whatever. So.
Okay, Andrea, any final comments on conservation grazing from you?
All I was going to say was that we do cross some of our natives here as well. So we've got Zorble cross Lincolns, which have got an amazing fleece, and they've gone to a Lincoln ram, and some Manx cross Leicester Longwool that have an absolutely amazing gradiated fleece, which goes from light chocolate through to black, both of which we've used on conservation grazing, and kept the maternal females. So hopefully those will be quite interesting. But the main thing with conservation grazing is always to put the right breed in the right place, but the right species and the right breed, and not to be afraid to look outside the box. So just because you've heard that potentially a breed comes from a certain area, if it has the trait that you need and you think it will suit your land, don't be afraid to try it. If it doesn't work, then you can always change breeds. As long as it doesn't affect the welfare of the animal, you can try almost anything.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks, three of you, for what's been a fascinating number of presentations, and thanks to those on the at the session for all of the useful questions. I think we've learned a lot this afternoon, and I hope it's of use to you in your businesses going forward. And hoping that you perhaps better recognise, or that everyone better recognises, that our native livestock breeds aren't just ornaments you see in fields, or hated phrase, rare for a reason. They're animals that have a real commercial benefit, particularly if you're trying to create a environmentally friendly, low impact, sustainable product. And as Joe has just said, plenty of ideas to be followed up. Okay, so that's it, I think. RBST is a charity, so we're here to help. If you want to follow up on any of the points that have been made, or any points that occur to you, do get in touch. We can be contacted through the website, and we'll do what we can to help. If you're interested in carrying out a bigger project, then as I say, we do have a consultancy wing, and we'd happy to talk about that in more detail as well. So unless there's anything else, I think we'll leave it there. And thanks for the lovely comments that are coming through on the chat. So bye everyone, and thank you so much.